Hello, I'm Jessica Richardson, and just want to thank you first for having me here. It's an honor to be here and to just share some of the things that I think are exciting, to share it with you and to talk about things that I'm very passionate and enthusiastic about. I'm going to be talking a lot about clinical tools that my lab has developed and why we've developed these tools, what these tools might tell you, and how we're hoping that it might give us more information about things that are very important to our patients with aphasia, which is life participation. And so you'll hear that phrase or those keywords a lot in this time that we have together. So no relevant relationships to disclose, and we'll just jump right in. So just a few facts. Persons with aphasia experience difficulties with a range of speech and language tasks. We know this, they have difficulty communicating. This affects a lot of their communication tasks, but this is very pervasive. It doesn't just affect the transmission of messages, the sending and receiving of messages for survival, for basic wants and needs, which unfortunately is what we focus a lot on in like the medical model of speech-language pathology and a lot of the goals that we have to write, which are let's treat them until they're able to do this and then, okay, send them on their merry way. But communication is used for so much more than that. It's used for not just transmission, but also for ritual. And what I'm talking about when I'm talking about ritual is friendships and fellowship and co-participation and things that you do in life that aren't just, hey, give me that soda, or hey, can you turn on the soccer game, right? We use communication for so much more than that. But we don't really treat communication in those areas and for those purposes. And we don't get paid to do it, honestly, right? There's no reimbursement model for that right now. Communication difficulties negatively impact quality of life and prevents participation in certain life roles and in life activities. Can lead to loss of employment and things of that nature. Traditional speech-language assessment measures and intervention approaches do not always identify or treat communication deficits that impact life participation. I'm going to highlight this later on in one of the sessions when I talk specifically about some groups of people with aphasia who score very high on traditional assessment measures. In fact, they score as not aphasic by the WOB. But they still have significant deficits that impact negatively their life participation. So discourse analysis measures consistently reveal significant differences between persons with aphasia and controls. This is good. We can use it to identify these differences. It's very sensitive to these people who score very high on the traditional measures. It picks up their deficits quite easily. But discourse analysis takes a very long time. Who has done discourse analysis in this room? 1, 2, 3. Who has thought about it but then looked at how much time it was going to take and said, no, not having it? Okay, both, right? It takes a very long time. Discourse is the foundation for everyday interactions, for functional conversations, and for fulfillment of life roles. But again, it's not something that we have a good treatment model for, an evidence base for treatment for. We don't have really great tools that clinicians can actually use in the real world. And that's one of the biggest barriers to doing discourse analysis in the real world, to have it inform us in some way. There's a great data source out there called Aphasia Bank. Has anyone heard of Aphasia Bank? Good. I'm glad you two answered. Now you've all heard of it and you need to spread the word. Aphasia Bank, I just took the current count of transcripts this morning because transcripts are added every day. But there are discourse transcripts and test results for 357 persons with aphasia, English speaking, from all over the US and also in England. There's also a Cantonese database, there's a Spanish database, there's a bilingual database. It's got tons of stuff within the Aphasia Bank database. There's also, last count, 180 control transcripts. So we have all of these normals or typical language speakers or control speakers who are performing the same tasks as these persons with aphasia are doing. And so we have the opportunity to use this database to actually develop some normative and standardized assessment measures for discourse. And I'm going to talk a lot about that. So Aphasia Bank is great because they give the WOB. They give the verb naming test. They give other tests that you might traditionally give. But they also have a very extensive discourse protocol. And I'll detail what they include in this discourse protocol. It focuses heavily on discourse, as discourse and narrative performance is likely the best candidate for predicting outcomes that matter most to the patient. And this is going to be return to work, improved quality of life, return to life roles like being a deacon in your church, or even babysitting your nephews. I mean, these are things that people can't do anymore after they are diagnosed with aphasia. And really just life and participation in it. And narrative performance, discourse performance is going to be a much better predictor of that than a WOB score. Oops. So I already said this. I'm going to say it again. Discourse analysis takes forever. And it is a slight exaggeration. It's not really forever. It's slightly less than forever. It's just a very, very long time. I know this firsthand. My dissertation, I chose to do CIUs for my measure, and it was awesome, and it was informative, and I was here until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, every morning during my dissertation, counting correct information units. Again, a very informative measure, wonderful. There are other measures like that that are wonderful and will tell you a lot of great stuff. You can't do it out in the real world, and you can hardly do it as a researcher who's paid to do that full time, right? So what we want, right, are discourse analysis tools that are standardized, because most clinicians, when they are surveyed recently, and Simmons-Mackey did a great survey of speech pathologists and what outcome tools they were using and what they thought about them. And they listed discourse analysis as being very subjective. And in fact, only 4% of the total respondents to this survey said that they had ever used discourse analysis. That's not a whole lot of people using it. And probably time is the reason, and training and the specialized training, which all relates back to time, right? So we would like to have discourse analysis tools that are standardized, that are norm referenced, and really would be great if they were non-transcription based, right? If we didn't have to transcribe them and code all of the errors and transcribe all of the errors, that would save us a whole lot of time. So we can use, if you remember, we have this aphasia bank. So the aphasia bank has this discourse protocol, and they've published it, and it's free. And they have scripted instructions for how the clinician is supposed to give this discourse protocol, so it's standardized, okay? We also have persons with aphasia doing this discourse protocol, and we have controls doing this discourse protocol of a nice span of ages. So we have the opportunity to develop norm references, right? And we'll talk about the last little sticky problem later. So using Aphasia Bank and working with the Aphasia Bank developers, and they're wonderful and helpful and are just very jazzed about anyone who wants to do research with them. They developed a tool called eVal, okay? And you can go onto the Aphasia Bank website, and I can help you with this later if you'd like, and even do a tour of the website if you'd like. But you go onto the Aphasia Bank website, and you have to download their program. It's called CLAN, and there's a manual, and you've got to learn about it. But you type in a command that pulls up this tool called eVal. And it leads to this GUI where you can select the comparison populations that you would like to compare your patient to. So let's say I have a patient who is anomic, and I had them tell several stories, perhaps the Cinderella story, a picture description. And you can see, I don't have a pointer, but I think I can do this. So I have to have transcribed the speech sample, first of all, and I have to have done it according to their transcription conventions. And they do have a long way and a shorter way, but it's not short, but it is shorter. And there are definitely certain rules that you have to follow, and if you follow those rules, then this program will be able to play with the file and to output a lot of really great information for you. You would select the participant. You could select which database you want to compare it to. I could just compare it to all persons with aphasia. I could just compare it to all of the controls. I could specifically compare it to all the other anomics in the database or all the fluent aphasia types in the database. I could do gender here, male or female, and I can also select my age range. If you're going to do something like this, I would definitely suggest you select your age range. There are age differences in discourse ability. And then this gem is it's referring to the type of story or the narrative task that they were doing. So a gem, it would be the Cinderella gem, is when they were telling the Cinderella story. The broken window gem is when they saw this picture sequence that you'll see later, and they're telling the story about it, or how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So you just click, 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 which we love that. And then it outputs this beautiful Excel file for you. And what you have in like 2 seconds is your patient right here. So this is our patient. Let's pretend it's our anomic, because that's what it is. An anomic patient that we're comparing to the anomic database between the ages of 45 and 65. And here is my patient up here, and their total utterances, their tokens, their TTR, word errors, the number of nouns that they used, all of that information during the sandwich, how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And then from the database is showing you here the range, so the min, the max, the mean of the anomics that you compared it to, and the standard deviation. And it even very nicely puts a little asterisk by the ones that are significantly different. Okay, so you're comparing your one patient to this database. So this is a way, if you wanted to have norms for the anomic database, it's a way to have a reference group, okay? So this would be the norms for our anomic reference group, or if you really want to stick norms to being normal, then you can compare it to the controls, right? And this tool does this really quickly, with the understanding that you had to have done the transcription, okay? So know that it's great, but know that there definitely is still a con there. Here's some more information that you can get from eval, and even more grammatical markers. You can get information about preposition, determiners, conjunctions, and even an indirect measure of efficiency. You have the number of retracings and the number of revisions that they did if you coded it correctly. So great information, right? We could really chart some change over time with this, and it wouldn't take too long to compare these Excel files at pre and post treatment, okay? Here's the issue, which is it still relies on transcription, okay? How many clinicians do you think are going to be able to do that? When clinicians probably spend a max of an hour per patient, according to that recent survey, on outcome measures assessment. And 1 minute of a discourse sample can take between 10 minutes to 60 minutes to transcribe correctly. All right? Who's going to do that? It's going to be hard. Like, you're really going to have to be motivated. You're going to be like working and then coming and sitting on the couch and watching house reruns and doing it, right? It's going to be in your spare time. You're not going to have time. And honestly, no one's really going to pay you to do this. So it's going to be something that you're going to have to be really motivated to do. But wouldn't it be great if we had some non-transcription based tools that were standardized and were norm referenced, that were checklists that you could do by listening to the audio and even trying to do online if you had to, or watching a video. And that's something that we've tried to do in my lab, and for many purposes, which I'll detail later. So McWhinney suggested, and he's the main guy, the main developer behind Aphasia Bank, that you could create a core lexicon from all of these controls that are in the database. So we could get the core lemmas that the controls are saying, and we could have this as a checklist and then compare the aphasics to this checklist to see like how close they were to typical words that are used when making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, when telling the Cinderella story, okay? And this might be, it would definitely be efficient, and it could be informative. But what exactly would it tell us? We're not quite sure. Would it tell you about narrative adequacy? Because a lot of our people might be able to circumlocute or to use alternative words and still tell you what they need to tell you. So what these values would mean, we're not quite sure. If they predict the narrative adequacy, if they tell us anything about the contextual use of the words, they don't tell us anything about that. It's just a count of how many of these words that they said, okay? So using Aphasia Bank and CLAN, we've created core lexicon lists for 5 discourse tasks. For the Cinderella story, the how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, for the broken window picture sequence, for the refused umbrella picture sequence, and for the cat rescue picture scene. The only ones we did not generate a core lexicon for were the ones that wouldn't have necessarily a shared lexicon, like the free speech samples and the important event, which might have somewhat of a shared lexicon. They might all say stroke and things like that, but we really focused on the ones where they would actually have a shared lexicon. And we based our core lexicon on the control transcripts in a aphasia bank database and the lemmas that were shared by 50% of the controls. Okay, so in order to figure out if this number or the score that they might get on a core lexicon measure really meant anything, we thought it would be good to generate something that would tell us about narrative adequacy as well. And so we did the same thing, except for it took a 1.5 years longer, where we went through every single transcript that was in the database and we pulled out every proposition, every concept, manually by hand. And then we saw what was shared across the participants, okay? And so we have now this checklist of the outline or the gist of the essential information that 50% of the control participants thought it was important to tell Cinderella, to convey Cinderella. And I don't know how many of you know the original Cinderella story. Does anyone know the original Cinderella story? Did you know that the stepsisters like cut off their toes and their heels to fit inside the shoe? Yeah, it's pretty gruesome. None of that showed up, so it's really good. It did not get included as a main concept. So using Aphasia Bank, we've created core lexicon lists for 4 of the 5 discourse tasks. The 5th is in progress. Again, this takes a very long time. And so we have concept lists shared by 50% of controls, and just for fun, in the appendix of the article that we've submitted, we've also included what's shared by 33% of the controls and 66% of the controls as well, so you guys could have that for your use. But all of the scores that I'm going to be talking about in the next section are operating from the 50% main concept list. Okay? So again, it took a lot of time, a whole lot of tears, and some self-injury. But we do have these wonderful lists where you have the words for the core lexicon that you literally could, in the hospital, sit and check off as you go the words that they're saying. For the shorter list, definitely for PBJ, it's a pretty short list. For Breaking Window, it's a pretty short list. And just check off the words that they've said. And then you have a measure. We don't know really exactly what that measure is telling you, but it's going to tell you how much they're differing from controls on use of the vocab, right? The first example here is actually a normal transcript or a control transcript from Aphasia Bank, and the one on the bottom is from a conduction, just to kind of show you the types of samples that come out of Aphasia Bank and what you would do on your checklist if you heard the conduction. Basically, the only one they're hitting on our fake short list here is ball, and that would be the only thing that you would check off on their list, okay? A lot of times you're able to get audio samples during discourse from patients, even in the acute setting, and so you can listen to it later and check, check, check. And we've actually done this. I'm running a hospital study, and we are able to do this in the acute setting, and it's very nice when some people don't consent to do audio or video. You can at least get some information for discourse online. So the main concept lists, as you can guess, are a lot more involved. This is just a sample of the Cinderella, and so we've simplified things to the simplest form as possible. For example, stepmother and/or stepsisters went to the ball. The things that are colored in colored print are things that are considered to be essential elements, so they're the things that were shared by 50%. A lot of times we would include like to the ball for number 13. Not everybody said to the ball. It was never like stepmother and or stepsisters went and then they went to the ball. Like it was never separated, but sometimes they would just say something about the ball and then they all went. So anyway, it wasn't considered to be essential for this concept. And as you can see, we've tried to include as much information as possible to help the person scoring, because obviously these concepts are said in many, many, many different crazy ways. Mostly actually by the controls. There's a lot of really crazy stuff that they want to tell you. So there's a sample from Cinderella. This is a sample from the Broken Window, and another sample from the peanut butter and jelly. As you can see, there's a lot of ways to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And so we actually had to have a lot of qualifiers for people who made it on one piece of bread versus two pieces of bread. And I mixed mine before I spread it, and I'm not the only one in the universe, so that's comforting. But there's a really whole lot of ways to make. You're like, no, you shouldn't do that. You got to keep it separate, right? So these are what our main concept checklists look like. And clinically, the way that I use it currently, again in my hospital, is that we've kind of taken the format from like the auditory comprehension portion of the WOB, but made it for discourse, where you have the essential elements that they're supposed to be to giving you, and you can circle if they do it. You can write below it if they say something else or alternative. And then there's a scoring system that I'll tell you about in just a moment. Of course, you have to either have this memorized or with you when you're scoring. I actually do have them memorized now, but I've spent a whole lot of time. And again, it does happen pretty quickly. And I'll tell you about future directions for making sure that that is actually a reliable way to score it. So we took the original way to score main concepts from the authors who developed the idea of this main concept. And so concept can get a code of accurate and complete, which is exactly what it sounds, or absent on the other end of the continuum, which is exactly as it sounds. In between there, there's accurate and incomplete. So some essential elements are produced correctly, but at least one essential element was omitted, and I'll show you some examples. Inaccurate, complete, all essential elements were produced, but at least one essential element was inaccurate. And we don't really see this necessarily in controls, but we wanted to retain this coding because we expected it in aphasics who were probably going to be giving us some semantic paraphasias. And then inaccurate, incomplete. So the concept was missing at least one essential element with another essential element produced incorrectly. So there are also numerical codes that are given to these codes, and you can add them all together and sum across all of the concepts that were coded to get a composite score. And so for the analyses that I'm going to talk to you about later, we use the composite score. But we do have other findings and other research that I'm happy to talk to you about at another date, where we've looked really closely at these differences in these codes and like how the anomics and the Broca's and the conductions are differing on the accurate and incomplete scores and on the inaccurate and complete scores. So we have some more nuanced information about that as well that I'm not going to talk about today. So here's some examples of Cinderella ran down the stairs of different codes from the aphasia bank transcripts. So she was running down the steps, accurate and complete. She run was an inaccurate and complete because there was no clear pronoun referent. So those are examples of two from there. Breaking windows, the boy was playing outside with the ball that he got credit for. He was playing soccer. An inaccurate complete was they kicked this around because there was an unambiguous referent for this, but the they was incorrect. So that's why he got inaccurate but complete. Okay? And then another couple of examples for peanut butter and jelly. Okay? So I'm happy to talk with you, talk with you about that in more detail next, but to do all of that work, I definitely want to thank the Chapman Foundation for their generosity. Aphasia Bank developers and contributors, we couldn't do this without the many researchers who are willing to put their transcripts on there. And my doctoral student who has spent many a tear and an hour with me on this, and then graduate students as well. So any questions about this section? Yes?
I noticed when you talk about the different stories that you can use with patients, some of them were storytelling and like procedural and like sequential. What determines which story you use for what patient?
So this is a good question, and I addressed this in a discussion in one of my papers, and I'll address it a little bit later, because in the acute setting I do it a little differently because you only have so much time in the acute setting. But I really want to get a discourse sample because we don't really get discourse samples in the acute setting. And so for the acute setting, I try to get a variety. So I don't want to just give a picture description because that's going to generate a certain type of discourse. So I give the broken window picture sequence, and I give the peanut butter and jelly procedural. And some of those are for hospital-acquired infections too. I'm not going to carry my Cinderella book around everywhere. But yeah, I've done an analysis where I've actually entered in all of the stories for persons with aphasia and just taken that composite score to see differences in the aphasia subtypes, because that might be the best prediction of how their conversational abilities might actually be, because you're kind of accessing all these different types of discourse acts. I mean, I think you got to know how much time you have, how much your patient is going to be able to do, and a lot of times, I need to say in the aphasia bank, there's really not any globals in the aphasia bank. I think there's about 5. They can't do the discourse task. I mean, they might be entered in, but they have nothing in their transcript. And there are alternatives for that the aphasia bank group suggests. But you know, you're going to do something different with them. So it definitely depends on the situation. It definitely depends on your location, on your patient, and we need more research to tell you a little more information about that. I will say later that it looks like our broken window picture description predicted pretty well our Cinderella, and so in most aphasia subtypes. There are 2 exceptions, and so it could be that if you only have a little bit of time, or there's a lot of fatigue, there's a fatigue factor, that you could give 1 or 2 short ones, and it might predict something that is maybe more pressing or hard for the patient. That was a long answer to a short question. Any other questions about this part? Yes?
You mentioned when you were talking about the aphasia bank that have to be specific with the age ranges. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what major differences might there be between groups in the aphasia bank.
Yeah, so, and that depends on actually which discourse task you're talking about too. So we're actually finding that for main concepts, just for main concept codes, that there's really not, let me find the best way to, let me start with relevant concepts, sorry. So what I didn't tell you about the story is that when we go line by line by line by line to pull out every proposition, we actually got a list for Cinderella of about 600 concepts that were produced, and I mean, we ended up with 24 that were shared, because people just say the craziest things. And what we noticed is that the probably 60 to 75-year-olds, they just had these crazy stories. And then your 80-year-olds, their stories were actually quite different in some of the concepts that they were telling us. And there was a lot less of information that they were telling us. Our 20-year-olds were not as much as the 60-year-olds, but were definitely less than like the 40-year-olds. And so these are actually in 20-year age bins that I have them. And for Cinderella specifically, it really looked like there were generational differences. So we're not, in the manuscript, we're not calling these age differences because we don't want people to think that if you give you know, a 20-year-old now this story, that they should talk like the 40-year-old 20 years from now, because they're going to know the same Cinderella story. Like, I think the Cinderella story has changed quite drastically. And I don't even know if this will be relevant like 40 years from now, especially, I mean, girl power, let's get rid of Cinderella. Let's have other stories, right, that we're teaching our children. So I think that these are definitely generational differences, and we didn't see as much or as distinct age differences in the main concepts in the other stories. We didn't see it as much in Broken Window. We didn't see it as much in Peanut Butter and Jelly Sandwich. What you do notice, if you look outside of those main concepts, and if you just look at like type token ratio and lexical diversity, that differs with age, and that a lot of times you'll get older patients, and Heather Harris Wright has done a lot of this research with aging and discourse, where you'll get older patients who might look worse on a lot of outcome measures, a lot of discourse measures, but they tell a better, more exciting, more engaging story that people actually like more, and that it's less coherent because they went off on some tangents but gave you some more details that made the story better. So it depends on what you're looking at, but there are definite differences in age, especially for the Cinderella, and for main concepts, for kind of like the two ends of the spectrum of age for almost all of the stories. Good questions. Okay, we ready for the next part?